This video will give an overview of the rich and diverse tapestry which forms the classical period of Indic thought, stretching from the mythic past, through human settlement in the subcontinent and the emergence of the first urban centres, through the appearance of the Indo-Aryan people, and finally the rise and fall of the Maurya Empire, a political entity which would not be matched in its control of India until the rise of the Mughals in the second millennia CE. Here, it is worthwhile noting the difficulty in establishing a chronological narrative for the plethora of thinkers and traditions that emerge in India over this period. Unlike China and the Mediterranean, no widespread tradition of chronicle or histories survive through to this day, although scholars argue that many of the popular epics and stories capture the stories of the clashing political actors throughout this period. The other issue is that, like other ancient cultures, large portions of the corpus of writings and traditions have not survived down to this time, either because they were not captured in the rich living oral traditions, or due to the nature of the writing materials and climate of India. Much of the writings from this period were composed on palm leaves, and the subtropical and tropical climates of coastal and southern India have been unkind to such materials. Regardless, this video should give a broad overview of the key muscle movements of intellectual, religious, and philosophical thought throughout this period. If you are interested in specific details on a particular thinker or tradition, in-depth videos are available in the comments below. Human settlement is believed to have begun in the subcontinent sometime between 73,000 and 55,000 years ago. These first settlers lived foraging lifestyles that have continued to be practiced, with some modifications, by certain groups up to this day. These people, who are called tribals by the Indian government but self-identify as the Adivasi, a word derived from Sanskrit which means the earliest inhabitants. From around 7000 BCE, many inhabitants, particularly around the great river systems of India, began to transition from foraging to farming and pastoralism as methods of sustenance. Those who continued to live in the forests, which dominated much of India's interior until the modern era, became the Adivasi, who lived partially in cooperation and partially in competition with these new agricultural communities. The Adivasi would often form trading relationships with the settled communities, exchanging forest goods for finished and manufactured goods from the villages and towns. However, whenever there has been pressure to expand from the settled communities, there has been a conflict with Adivasi, who have been alternatively killed, driven off into less fertile areas, or converted and incorporated into mainstream settlement culture. Around 4500 BCE, agricultural density and settlement began to coalesce into urban life on the Indus River in what is now modern Pakistan. These people eventually began to form a sophisticated urban culture covering a vast area with trade connections into the Near East and Africa. This culture also developed its own script. However, this fell out of use after the culture's collapse, and the few rare fragments remain undeciphered. It has come to be known alternatively as the Indus Valley culture, after the valley in which it arose, or the Harappan culture, after the site of the first archaeological discovery. Flourishing between 2500 and 1900 BCE, the culture was contemporaneous with urban development in Mesopotamia and Egypt, but waned, possibly due to widespread droughts and climatic change. Around the same time as this was occurring, tribes of Indo-European peoples migrated and settled in India from the northwest, religiously and culturally linking to the great diaspora of peoples that moved through Persia and Europe at the same time. These peoples called themselves Aryan, which means noble, and spoke a language called Sanskrit, which would come to dominate Indian written literature and act as a lingua franca throughout the subcontinent until the late medieval period. One hypothesis for the arrival of these peoples is that it was in the form of an invasion, de-urbanizing the earlier Indus Valley culture and conquering northern India as their own territory. However, this doesn't appear to have played out in the archaeology, and instead a more complex picture of migration, raiding, cooperation, and conquest appears to have occurred. These Sanskrit-speaking arrivals formed the third great population injection, which created the basic admixture of the subcontinent's population, although new people would continue to arrive, integrate, assimilate, and sometimes upturn the cultural and linguistic patterns of India. The Indo-Aryans brought their own gods, culture, and traditions. These have been preserved in the texts known as the Vedas, literally knowledge or wisdom, derived from the verb to know or see. a collection of 4 works, the longest and most studied of which is called the Rig Veda. These texts detail the myths, legends, rituals, and practices of the Indo-Aryans. This includes a pantheon of Vedic gods who share similar attributes to the early Persian, Nordic, and Greco-Roman gods, such as Indra, the thunderbolt-wielding champion of the gods who brings the rains, similar to Zeus or Jupiter in the Mediterranean, or Thor amongst the Germanic peoples. The Vedas came to be considered sacred and revealed truth, called Shruti, meaning that which is heard, as opposed to Smrti, or that which is remembered, which represents much of the later Orthodox Indian religious and philosophical thought. Due to its preeminent status, each syllable has been memorized and pronounced correctly. This allows the text to be transmitted orally for a significant time before finally being committed to a text as a much later date, preserving the most archaic form of Sanskrit, which came to be known as Vedic Sanskrit. Furthermore, the rich Vedic and post-Vedic mythological and legendary traditions of the Indo-Aryans adapted to and incorporated aspects of local deities and beliefs. In a process known as Sanskritization, the female, meat-eating, and violent divinities of many southern Indian peoples were incorporated into the Vedic and post-Vedic pantheon as peaceful vegetarian wives to their Indo-Aryan equivalents, incorporating local beliefs in a broader religious context. However, even following this process, the traditional and more violent incarnations of the local divinities continued to be worshipped side by side with the new Vedic institutions. The Vedas also include ethological myths concerning the place and role of the 4 social classes in Vedic society. These classes, called Varna, theoretically stem from the 4 components of the cosmic man Purusha, from whom humanity was created. The Brahmin, or priests, were derived from the mouth, as they recited the sacred oral Vedas. The warriors and kings, called Kshatriya, were derived from the arms, as they provided the strength to protect society. The Vaishyas, or merchants and farmers, were the legs which held up the body, and the final Varna were the Shudras, labourers who supplied and supported the whole body by acting as its feet. Outside the Varna system existed the people who have traditionally been called the untouchables, but who now prefer to be called Dalits, which can be translated into broken or scattered in Hindi or Sanskrit. These people undertook the tasks and functions in society which were seen so ritually and spiritually polluting as to exclude them from the bonds of normal society. Varna is but one aspect of the complex system which came to be known as caste in the West, with a more localized and immediate importance not necessarily derived from one's Varna, but from your jati, which translates to birth. This is the mixture of occupation, location, religion, and language that defines the specific lifestyle, potential marriage partners, and dietary habits of different communities, and has allowed for many different groups of peoples to cohabitate in India whilst retaining their unique customs and traditions. However, Varna and Jati have both come under criticism from within and without India as a system of oppression. Some Shudra peoples have claimed that Varna represents the yoke of Indo-Aryan rulers over the former Indus Valley peoples, whilst Dalits and Adivasi, who exist outside the Varna system, have embraced non-Vedic religions or even Maoism in an attempt to overcome their marginalization. Scholars have labelled the early Indo-Aryan culture which developed in India at this time and which is captured in the Vedas as Brahminic, drawing on the idea that it reflects the ideas and biases of the Brahmin Varna who acted as the gatekeepers to the ritual and religious powers in this archaic time. However, some of these scholars have also proposed that even from within this culture, there was dissatisfaction with what was seen as the transactional and overly ritualistic nature of the sacrifices and rites prescribed in the earliest parts of the Vedic texts. This theory is used to explain the existence of the Upanishads, loosely translated to sitting alongside, as in sitting next to the feet of a teacher, or possibly esoteric doctrines, which are a series of texts incorporated into the Vedas. It is postulated that these more complex ideas were formulated by forest ascetics who congregated in remote ashrams to piece together this sometimes bewildering and contradictory compilation of ideas. The Upanishads raise questions as to the very existence of nature, life, and reality. They propose that all life is animated by Atman, meaning breath, and eventually coming to mean the individual's soul. This Atman is separated from Brahman, meaning the world soul, and not to be confused with Brahmin, the priestly Varna. The Atman is separated from Brahman due to ignorance, and is forced to go through cycles of birth, life, death, and rebirth, known as reincarnation in the West and as samsara in Sanskrit. Finally, these texts describe moksha, or release, which is the escape from samsara and the return to Brahman. The metaphysical understanding of the world, which is described in the Upanishads, would dominate later Indian religious and philosophical thought. Some scholars postulate that it is against this mainstream norm that several heterodox movements later developed, sometime around the 6th century BCE. The division has been described by those who subscribe to the orthodox system as astika, literally that which exists, and nastika, or the unbelievers. However, many heterodox traditions later appropriated the term shramana, which translates to one who labours, rather than the negative connotation of nastika. The key difference between the two traditions is that the Shramanic movements rejected the authority of the Vedas, while the Astika movements embraced the Vedas as Shruti, or revealed truth. However, both traditions were heavily influenced by both each other and these earlier texts, eventually separating out into several distinct religious and philosophical movements. Amongst the heterodox movements emerged skeptical thinkers who doubted all forms of existence beyond sense perception, called Ajnana, as well as materialists who mocked the metaphysical speculations of the other schools, who were called Lokayata or Charvaka. These two traditions were widely disparaged as hedonists and moral degenerates by both their fellow heterodox travellers and the mainstream Brahmanic culture, but they acted as a whetstone against which the logical arguments and ideas of these other schools were sharpened. However, both schools slowly fell into obscurity, although skepticism found its own home amongst later Buddhist philosophy. One of the earlier but less influential of the Shramana movements was the Ajivika. This sect believed in a deterministic universe, but still adhered to the harsh asceticism which was popular amongst many of the Shramanic sects. Eventually petering out, the sect did have an important influence on other of the more important movements, including the Jains, who had potentially incorporated aspects of Ajivika doctrine into the Digambara sect of its faith. The Jains, who were followers of the Ford maker Mahavira, believed that all physical objects have a soul, including the elements which compose the world. They believed that all living things were necessarily dependent on the suffering of other souls, and that only through strict asceticism, renunciation of worldly pleasures which led to the suffering of others, and a dedication to the life of aparigraha or non-violence, that the soul could attain moksha. These Jains continue to thrive as a small community in both India and now throughout the world, and their ideas would be very influential on later thinkers, including Mahatma Gandhi. The most successful of the Indian Shramanic movements was undoubtedly Buddhism, centered on the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the historic Buddha. The Buddhists attempted to chart a middle path between the sensual pleasures of everyday life and what they saw as the unnecessary hardships of the Jain and other ascetic sects. Buddhism was based around four noble truths, which can loosely be summarized as 1. All life is suffering, 2. That attraction, aversion, and ignorance lead to our entanglement in rebirth and continued suffering, 3. That escape from suffering exists in the form of nibbana or nirvana, literally extinguishment, where the causal phenomena of the mind ceases to exist, and that finally, 4. The path to nibbana can be found through the ethical precepts of the Eightfold Path. You may have heard me use the term nibbana and nirvana. This is because the recorded sayings and injunctions of the Buddha and his followers were recorded and transmitted in Pali, a derivative vernacular language spoken by the common people in northern India. Nibbana, as a Pali term, is compared to nirvana as the Sanskrit term. The use of Pali as a liturgical language is demonstrative of both Buddhism specifically, but the heterodox movements more broadly, attempting to connect with the common people in a way that earlier elite Brahminic culture did not. Astika mainstream beliefs did not stand still whilst the flowering of the heterodox Shramanic movements unfurled. A process, often called the Brahminic synthesis, saw the development and elaboration of Brahminic methods into a new form. This borrowed heavily from the non-violent and spiritual forms of the shramanic movements, seeing animal sacrifices largely going by the wayside and a focus on the philosophical and spiritual underpinnings of this belief. Some scholars use this as the point at which Brahmanism is seen as transforming into Hinduism, although it should be remembered that this is somewhat an anachronism, as the term Hindu and Hinduism originates from outsiders to India trying to describe the complex mix of religious and philosophical positions held by Astika Indians, although the term has been borrowed and embraced by many modern Hindu practitioners. Traditionally, this Brahminic synthesis saw the emergence of the 6 orthodox schools of Indian philosophy. However, some scholars suggest that some of these schools might have actually been anti-Vedic and atheistic in background, and that they were whitewashed and later appropriated into Astika theology. Fortunately for the listener, these 6 schools come in pairs which complement each other, making them slightly easier to remember. The first pair of schools is the two which are most uncontroversial in their inclusion in the orthodox camp. They are traditionally dated back to 2 individuals, a teacher called Bhadrayana and his student called Jamini. Jamini founded a school called Purva-Mimamsa, meaning earlier inquiries, due to its focus on the earliest components of the Vedas, which acted as exegesis and a subtle logical argument which defended relying upon the Vedas alone as revealed wisdom. Purva-Mimamsa thus lays the logical framework for the school of Bhadrayana, sometimes called Uttara-Mimamsa or later inquiries, due to its focus on the latter components of the Vedas, being the Upanishads. This school is known more commonly as Vedanta, or the end of the Vedas, as it attempts to systematize the teachings of Brahman and Atman, which are found in these earlier texts. In contrast to the monism of Vedanta, the Vaisheshika school of Kannada proposed an atomistic model for the universe, based upon elementary substances which combined and recombined into the phenomena which we encounter on a day-to-day basis. Earlier than the similar atomistic philosophy which emerged in Greece, the Vaisheshika proposed the moksha could be attained by gaining ever-increasing knowledge and understanding of how this causative and atomistic universe functioned. The Nyaya school, which was founded by Askapada Gautama, not to be confused with Gautama Buddha, further built upon the metaphysical base of the Vaisheshika and developed a sophisticated formal logic to be used to obtain philosophical proofs in the arguments about the true nature of the world. Some scholars have debated whether both these schools actually were originally anti-Vedic and promoted an atheistic understanding of the cosmos, although whatever is really the case, they were both incorporated into orthodox thought. However, their influence waned in the later Middle Ages. The final pairing of schools rejected both the monism of Vedanta and the atomism of Vaisheshika. Kapila, the legendary founder of the Samkhya school, articulated a doctrine of duality that saw samsara as the unfortunate side effect of purusha, or spirit, as mistaking itself as being caught up with prakriti, or nature. The only way to overcome this entanglement and attain release from the samsara cycle it caused was through realization of the radical difference between these two substances. The 6th school, called Raja Yoga, which was founded by a figure called Patanjali, put forward an 8-limbed path by which the devotee could realize this radical difference, based upon ethical constraints, physical postures, and meditation. It also added a healthy dose of theism and the idea of Ishvara, the divine Purusha which has never been entangled with Prakriti. As the Astika and Shramanic movements co-developed, bouncing off one another like gems in a tumbler, ever increasing in sophistication in their arguments and debates, the political situation in the subcontinent did not stand still. The original Indo-Aryan settlers had formed small kingdoms and republics, primarily focused on the river systems of northern India, which provided a reliable tax base of farmers. One of the most successful centres of this river-based agriculture was the Indo-Gangetic Plain, and the most successful of the early Indian empires to emerge from this region was the Maurya Empire, based on the city of Pataliputra. The empire, named after its founder Chandragupta Maurya, conquered large portions of northern India from 322 BCE, reaching its zenith under Chandragupta's grandson Ashoka. The Maurya Empire has also benefited at this stage from the weakening of the northwestern Indic kingdoms, which had been decimated and fragmented by the invasions of Alexander the Great in the 320s BCE. Furthermore, The Seleucids, successors of Alexander, handed nominal control of their eastern Indian domains to Chandragupta in exchange for war elephants, providing him with a much-needed revenue and the stable border with the former Persian Empire. The Maurya Empire also saw an unprecedented patronage for the Shramanic movements, with the Jains claiming that Chandragupta converted to their faith after abdicating from the throne and starving himself to death in the manner of a Jain saint. Ashoka converted to Buddhism after the particularly bloody subjugation of the neighbouring kingdoms, and personal details of his conversion can still be found carved on pillars that he erected in prominent locations throughout his kingdom. The Maurya Empire also saw the development of the Brahmi script, which Ashoka used to inscribe his pillars. This script formed the basis of later Indian writing and alphabets. However, the debate over its origin as an either indigenous or a derivative script from neighbouring Semitic writing is hotly debated. From the death of the Buddha and through the time of favour and royal patronage under the Maurya Empire, Buddhism had fractured and splintered as the followers of the Buddha debated and disagreed over specific points of dogma and doctrine. The two most important groups which developed out of this split were the Theravada, or Way of the Elders, and the Mahayana, or Greater Vehicle schools, although in this early stage it was the Theravada who we will focus on. These sects developed sophisticated psychologies and cosmologies, called the Abhidharma, to explain the inner workings of the mind, the universe, and how the two correlated. Although the Buddha himself had denigrated philosophy as a distraction from the real task of nirvana, these works provided a philosophical undergirding for later Buddhist thought. It is also during this time that Buddhist missionaries, sponsored by the Maurya Empire, carried their faith into modern-day Sri Lanka and as far west as Persia and Rome. Although this western branch of Buddhism proved to be short-lived, Theravada Buddhism flourished in Sri Lanka, and from there was immensely important in spreading the religion through Southeast Asia, an area which has long been under the influence of Indian Vedic culture and practices up to this point. Although the Shramanic practices had early attempted to cultivate broad appeal with the masses, their message had ended up resonating at the highest levels. Similarly, as part of their Brahminic synthesis, Vedic culture adapted popular gods and worship amongst the masses, including the epic works of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. These epic tales are some of the largest and longest works of epic prose in human history, but embedded in the Mahabharata is one of the jewels of Indian philosophy, the Bhagavad Gita, a text which is set on the battlefield as the god Krishna gives counsel to his friend and combatant Arjuna as he wavers in his duty to fight against his cousins and seize back his kingdom. The text, which is believed to have reached its final form around 200 BCE, is one of the most influential pieces of religious and philosophical literature from South Asia. It draws upon the themes of the Upanishads, the Vedanta, Samkhya, and Yoga schools to give a holistic message of both the reality of life and the paths one can take within it. It unifies popular belief with the monism of Vedanta, affirming the doctrines of Atman and Brahman. However, it also accepts the dualism of Samkhya, with Purusha and Prakriti representing the mechanisms of samsara, although both are still technically generated from the oneness of Brahman. Finally, the text unifies three ways of living within Indian society and allows them to coexist as equal paths to liberation. For the king and warrior, the text urges the path of the detached action, or karma yoga. For the scholar or mystic, the path of jnana yoga, and for the average devotee who wants to find moksha in faith, he presents the path of bhakti yoga. As a genius work of theology, the Bhagavad Gita attacks the Shramanic movements, which seek to remove the follower from society, whilst at the same time providing an inclusive and persuasive argument for a faith that is attractive to the ruler, intellectual, and the great mass of the population alike. The common culture and political stability of the Maurya Empire could not last, and following Ashoka, a string of weaker kings steadily lost territory and control before finally the empire collapsed around 185 BCE following a coup which saw the airless death of the last Maurya ruler. Although the leaders of the coup established a new state, the Shunga Empire, this failed to hold the Maurya domains together, and the state fragmented. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom invaded from the northwest, establishing the short-lived Greco-Indian kingdoms. Novel exchanges of ideas and unique compositions of Indo-Greek cultures flourished for a short period in the northwest of the subcontinent. although the two-way flow of ideas, goods, and peoples is believed to have both pre- and post-dated this occurrence. However, it is at this point that a new turn in philosophical and religious dynamism occurs beyond the bounds of this video, as new thinkers take up the reins to understand reality, the cosmos, and our place in it.